I think Pearl is a story about a young woman who has dreams and aspirations to have a life more exciting than the one she was born into. It came together in a strange way. We were heading down to New Zealand to make X, and it was in the middle of the peak of COVID. And New Zealand was a safe place to make a film. And we had this infrastructure set up with a crew and a cast, and we were building all these locations for X, and we were spending all this effort to make a movie, and the only place on earth at the time you could make a movie. And it made sense to me that, like, well, we should try to make two movies, because while we're there, we should make the best use of everything that we have. And it initially started as like, well, what other movie could we make with all of the stuff that we had there? But a sequel didn't make sense because X was a movie about people that went to a farm and sort of terror ensues, and just more people going to a farm wasn't that interesting. But one of the characters in X, Pearl, who Mia was playing, we had been talking about her backstory a lot because you don't get a lot of that in the film. And that became interesting. And so it was like, well, if we went backwards and we did her like sort of origin story, for lack of a better term, there was an interesting story there to tell, and it used all of the same, locations and everything that we were working on. So it made sense production-wise, and that's where it started. And then we had to do 2 weeks of quarantine to get into New Zealand, and in that time, Mia and I collaborated on a script that we thought, best case scenario, we make a movie. Worst case scenario, it becomes a really fleshed out backstory for a character, and X becomes a better movie for it. And credit to A24, they loved the script, and we made 2 movies back to back.
Pearl is a young woman who's quite naive, and she's got a lot of ambitions, and we follow her through this film, and we see her trying to make the best of a really difficult situation.
So I play the local projectionist at the cinema, who sort of plays the role in Pearl's life of just fanning the spark of her ambition, and giving her a little casual and easy encouragement that kind of sets her on her journey to pursue her ambitions.
It's 1918 for a couple of reasons. One, when we just sort of like reverse engineered the story and we subtracted years from old Pearl's life from X, it landed right around 1918, and then of course 1918 was very topical because of what we were all going through, and it was a story about isolation and whatnot. So it became another interesting layer to set it then due to the Spanish flu and the end of World War I. And when we were writing it, we were all going through this sort of bizarreness that was the beginning of the pandemic, and so I think it added a layer to the movie that was not just topical, but kind of took something that otherwise would be a retro movie and sort of modernized it in a way. And I think it helps an audience have a way in with Pearl and her isolation, and to sort of empathize with her a little bit more.
Well, this was my first time writing or co-writing a script, and I found the process at the beginning quite daunting, and I would just put a timer on my phone, maybe 30, 45 minutes at a time, and I would just kind of write a kind of stream of consciousness and just see what comes out, and just kind of put threw a lot of things at the wall, and some things stuck, and Ty would then implement that into the script, and that's sort of how we went about forming the entire script.
Well, when we made X was a movie that was very informed and affected by sort of 1970s auteurish, independent exploitation cinema, a certain era in film. And Pearl just had nothing to do with that. Pearl was about a young woman who had the hopes and dreams and ambitions, and was sort of enthralled by the glamour that, a life in the movies or on stage would offer. And so it just it seemed interesting to take a golden age of Hollywood, or almost like a Disney type aesthetic, a youthful, almost naive aesthetic, and put a grounded, dark psychological story within that, because I had never seen that before, and it felt fresh. It felt like a way to tell the story in an interesting way. And then once you start doing that, you really kind of have to commit to it, or else it starts to feel like a spoof, and we never wanted that. So we really wanted it to feel like, okay, we're going to put you in a time and place, and it's a fantastical time and place, but we're going to fully commit. And so everything from the design to the wardrobe choices, even to the hair and makeup, it's all just sort of like within that pastiche. And I think that creates a really just interesting contrast to what the story is.
It's a challenge in a couple of ways, because we don't see most of that. The film has this Technicolor sort of backdrop sky feel to it, and a lot of that does not appear on set. So to a certain extent, it's about trusting Ty that he's going to do all that work after the fact. And as actors, you're just playing the scene as you play the scene. I think it probably came into play in a couple of times, in a couple of moments having to do with performance. A moment where Pearl shows up and I sort of sweep her into my arms and pull her into a door. Ty described the shot and sort of what movie that was supposed to feel like. I think that might have been sort of a Singing in the Rain, or I don't know, some reference like that to get the rhythm of it. But for the most part, we don't get to see it until we see the movie in the theaters.
You know, certainly, I think when we finished X, we really needed to detox from the 1970s, and I feel like we probably watched Wizard of Oz just as a palate cleanser. And then there were some obvious nods to it here and there. I know, like, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, we talked about a little bit. But everything else, I mean, for Elliot Rocket, the DP, and myself, and Tom Hammock, the production designer, we probably looked at some stuff that was like, anything from those films to Douglas Sirk films to The Red Shoes to things like that, just for the palette of it all, but not so much for the movies as much as just sort of like palette, because it's an interesting thing that everybody kind of knows what that look is, but like when you actually start to go create it, it is strange. And it is strange to go like, could we really make the dress this red? And then if the dress is that red, we really need to go way further with the wallpaper and things like that. And that became a balancing act. And so there was a lot of yes, there were mood boards, but they were mostly for things for like color palettes and things like that. I feel very grateful that people have really reacted amazing to it so far. And I think a big credit of that is to Mia's performance. I mean, she's in every frame of the movie. And if it, the movie only works if she works. And I think it's such a commitment to it, and it's such a commitment to the material, that I think that's where the emotional, I think there's a relatability to it, even though the movie is kind of larger than life in its style. At its core, it's about a person, it's about their psychological and emotional struggles and desires, and I think that's relatable universally to everybody. And so even though it's a pretty wacky movie and some really demented things happen, it's ultimately about, wishing you had a different life, and I think everybody can relate to that.
I hope that they come away from watching the movie understanding Pearl and empathizing with her. And, it's been dubbed a horror movie, but I think it's far more than that. And really, like, the horror lies in her dreams dying and her having to come to terms with that. And so I hope that they, ultimately just are moved in some way.
I think the fun thing about combining watching Pearl with watching X is that they're very different genres, and X is a real slasher, like a fun and scary and just big movie, and Pearl feels very intimate and I would say much more like a tragedy, a really moving tragedy. It has all of the entertaining elements of a great horror psychological thriller, but I think the core of it is really the character of Pearl, and finding, as I was watching it, finding myself really rooting for her all the way through, despite the dark turns that she takes.